welcome to the Bookseller webinar on export sales. Before we begin, I'd like to thank David Buckland and Pan Singh for their sponsorship of the Export Nibby. David is one of our panelists today, and I'd like to invite him to say a few words about the award. David.
Thank you, Emma. Pan Singh is a distributor in Singapore and Malaysia, and therefore an export customer for quite a number of British publishers. And looking at British publishing from this external perspective, we felt that the consistently high calibre, the marked dedication and enthusiasm of the export sales staff that we've been dealing with for decades now did not perhaps quite get the recognition we felt they deserved. And so we sponsored these awards to reflect the fact that, frankly, without the support of all these talented people working for British publishers, I'm not sure Pan Singh would still be here to have sponsored these awards. Thank you.
Well, I'm also delighted to be joined today by the two winners of the award, Catherine Stokes, Head of UK and Export Sales and Marketing at Nosy Crow, and Jonathan Atkins, International Director at Macmillan. So many congratulations to you both. I hope you had a great evening celebrating. A few housekeeping points. My name's Emma House and I'm chairing this panel today. We're going to be running for an hour, so until 11 o'clock British Summer Time, which will include time for questions. The questions will be moderated by the Bookseller team, so please submit any questions that you have in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please select all panelists and attendees, including naming the panelist to whom your question is directed, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Please also use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to say hello to your fellow colleagues. I won't be keeping my chat on, so if you do need to communicate with the Bookseller team, please use the chat to send a message to MLO. And if we do lose communication, then you will be emailed a fresh link to log back in. So let's get the discussion going. Jonathan and Catherine, I'm going to start with you. And I think what we wanted to explore first of all is how has the pandemic impacted on your export sales? You know, what trends have you seen? Which markets have been most impacted, if at all? So Jonathan, let's start with you.
Yeah, obviously the impact has been pretty devastating in certain countries. When we were looking at this around about the time of the London Book Fair, and probably the week after when we went into lockdown, it was a pretty scary time. We had no idea how we had to learn new ways of working together. We had to learn new ways of working with our customers. And we had no idea how long this was going to take. What's happened since then is that we have learned a lot from the last 3 months. For us, this month, June, is a real month of recovery, and we're seeing a lot of markets coming back to where they used to be, but we are, incredibly sensitive to the problems out there. Not all bookshops are back up and running as they were before, and we're determined to work with everyone to try and get us back to a situation where we can anticipate some good sales in the future. But it's been tough, and of course, in international, we were the first ones to really be impacted by this in the first place. So at the end of January, beginning of February, we were seeing signs from China of lockdown, and that sort of presaged a lot of the problems that everyone else has had.
So which markets would you say have been most adversely affected?
So clearly, Spain and Italy and France in Europe were the first ones that locked down in a very significant way, and of course it's really encouraging that they've come back slightly since then. But we're very conscious that it's going to take time to fully recover. One of the markets I'm most worried about now is India, actually, where the new cases every day are between 10 and 15,000 people, where they had a severe lockdown and then came out of lockdown, but there's still massive structural problems. And so, we're seeing some parts of the world where it's going to take a long time to recover.
And Catherine, what's been your experience? Have your markets been impacted and your export sales been impacted?
It's been very, very, very similar to Jonathan, and I think we just have to continue to respond to each country and their very specific needs. In actual fact, I mean, you know, we've seen we've been able to support countries where shops have remained open, such as Sweden and Taiwan and Korea, but obviously inevitably business has been much slower. And also because we didn't publish as well for a couple of months as well, we took the decision not to publish. So we had orders that were logged before everything was held up, and they weren't cancelled, but it's very slow. But the orders that we've seen and our figures continue to be you know, optimistically good, because the countries all locked down and then unlocked at different times. So that's helped us to have a, you know, a smaller revenue stream, but one that we can manage and see light at the end of the tunnel with. But it's very, very similar to Jonathan. And, you know, I think across the board from colleagues that I've spoken to, we had a level of sales that was half across all countries in April.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
April was tough, and since then it feels like those markets that are dominated by online sales are the ones that have recovered the fastest. So China, for example, is actually for English language books is incredibly dependent on online sales, and that's where the part of the recovery has come from. In Europe, obviously Germany is a big online market for us, and Amazon in Germany seems to be servicing the whole of Europe at the moment, and we've seen massive orders coming from there, and particularly on the backlist. Actually, one of the trends we've seen is that backlist sales have been incredibly healthy, while actually frontlist has been quite difficult to get in. I mean, obviously we pushed back a lot of frontlist titles that we knew were going to suffer from the lack of promotional activity around now, but even then, some of the frontlist titles have really struggled to be discovered, just simply because it's so difficult to. So many frontlist titles rely on being discovered in a bookshop, being displayed in a bookshop, and people sharing their enthusiasm for those new titles, whereas backlist is a more known, you know, entity.
I think what's interesting is that it's followed actually the same pattern as the UK in lots of ways. You know, there was a sudden dominance online, and obviously we publish only children's books, and in many areas we've seen a huge surge online for our children's books because they became more important to everybody in lockdown.
Absolutely. And David, what's been the experience for the markets that Pansing serves?
Well, for Singapore and Malaysia, and I think more generally for Southeast Asia, I'm not talking about North Asia because their experience is a bit different, sort of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. For Southeast Asia, first of all, the market's dominated by bricks and mortar physical bookstores. Online in these territories tends to be rather stunted. There's a lot of effort locally, and indeed sales through online stores have grown. This is from a very small base, and the online market for physical English language books is dominated by Amazon.co.uk, Amazon.com, and the Book Depository. So there have been increases in online business, but they've been relatively small. And since we are so dependent on physical bricks and mortar booksellers, the fact that these were all shut during months-long lockdowns had devastating is the word, I think, for business. And that's the most obvious effect of COVID-19, but it's not the only one. So there have been other things that have happened. So, for example, most of the books that we import from British publishers were air freighted, and they were air freighted on commercial flights. So, in other words, if you took a sort of a A380 Singapore Airlines from Heathrow to Singapore, there might well have been books on it in the cargo space that we had ordered. Well, with the collapse of that kind of commercial travel, air freight costs, it was still possible to air freight things, but the air freight costs went up to about 7 times the previous rate, which for books made it uneconomic. In addition to which, of course, books have in air freight terms, books have the characteristic of being having a lot of weight but relatively little value. So you'd also get bumped quite frequently if there were infrequent flights. So that's another impact of COVID-19. So it's been quite devastating. Frankly.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point that you make about air freight. And we're 3 months in, sort of like, to the pandemic. If we say we started in March, I mean, what other knock-on effects are we seeing? Obviously, air freight costs is one of them, and logistics of actually getting books around the world. Have we seen any other knock-on effects similar to that?
Well, there's one that follows on from that in terms of stock management, and that's a worry coming up to Christmas as well, because, you know, we're now relying on sea freight, and the turnaround time is so much higher. So it's going to be difficult for my colleagues in Singapore to get that stock that they need. You know, if there is a sudden surge and a sudden popular title, it's going to be very difficult to manage that stock.
Yeah,
it has improved. Sorry, Jonathan, after you.
I was just going to say, in a market like India, where actually air freight is pretty much the necessary means of freighting into the country, because sea freight, it takes such a long time. It's the difference between a week and 12 weeks. And we've noticed that both air freight and sea freight costs have gone up. And so we already do lots of local printing in India. We're going to have to do a lot more local printing, and explore options like POD as well, short print runs. You know, it requires, in a market like that, a complete reassessment of our supply chain.
And do you think that's the same for other markets similar to India, Jonathan? Do you think that you'll explore more sort of like local printing and print on demand options in others?
I think print on demand has got to be explored in a much more meaningful way than we've been able to do so far. So I think, but of course, print on demand on the whole is relevant to, you know, black and white books and not children's books. So, you know, locally printing generally can't really be done on children's picture books. And so that's a completely different challenge. But the reality is that there are not that many markets where, you know, local printing makes sense. For us, it's pretty much, you know, Australia, South Africa and India, where we do the majority of our local prints, and everywhere else we're physically shipping out of our UK warehouse.
Yeah. And David, we're dealing with two relatively big publishers here. I know Nosy Crow is not as big as Macmillan, but certainly bigger than you would. But certainly not as big as some of the much smaller publishers that are out there. And David, I think you probably deal with a lot more of the smaller publishers as well. Do you think the impact's going to be more significant on them than the bigger publishers?
Almost certainly, I would have thought. One issue that we haven't actually discussed yet is the issue of credit. And that's obviously going to become more of a problem going forward, I would have thought, because we are in a supply chain which generally is supplying our customers on credit. And although there are ways that you can mitigate that, credit insurance, for example, that's obviously, even if you can afford it, and for small publishers that may be problematic, it's certainly going to get a lot more expensive. So there's going to be, I think, there may be a winnowing process here where some customers, you know, will they survive? And certainly that's a worry to us. Now, we have no, at this particular point, we have no reason to believe that any one of our major customers in Singapore or Malaysia is about to disappear. But on the other hand, there have been some very marked effects on them of this. And one of our major customers in Malaysia has decided that of its 28 pre-pandemic stores, it will pull out of or shut 21 of them.
Wow.
So now that, but it's not quite as bad as it might appear, because it is a fairly sort of major restructuring, and they're going to sort of be looking more at emphasizing online sales. But our analysis of our own sales to this particular major customer, only of the 21 stores that shut, only 15% of our revenue from this customer in the 12 months before COVID-19 struck were actually coming from these 21 stores. So 85% was coming from the 7 that remain. And of those 21 stores that shut, because in our market we're supplying on a sale or return basis, they were also returning an outsized proportion of the customers' returns, which is a huge cost to us and to the supply chain generally. So it isn't necessarily a bad thing that this customer has decided to restructure in this way. It's possible that, frankly, these other stores were not really pulling their weight. So it can't be taken that that restructuring is, you know, it sounds very dramatic, and certainly it's a response to COVID-19. But it's perhaps a good thing in the long run rather than a bad thing.
I think it's part of this building back better, if you like, and building back differently. We know the world's not going to be the same. So, you know, that includes the same for our bookstore customers, I guess. I think, Jonathan, you
I was just going to say, I've been encouraged how resilient our booksellers have been and how good they've been at communicating with us about issues like this. I mean, there have been some casualties, and one very sad casualty in Denmark was Arnold Busk, who's been going for many, many years and fell by the wayside very recently. So it's very sad, but I think that as you say, I'd like to think we will come out of this stronger.
Yeah.
Go, Catherine. I was going to say, I agree with Jonathan. I think there's been a really good level of communication from our customers when they've flagged things quite early on so that we can help them in any way we can. But we're really going to talk about this later. But in terms of how we can help them, I think there's been, certainly from Nosy Crow, a massively bigger concentration on digital assets and digital ways of working to facilitate all those customers just get better at selling online, and now the bricks and mortar are back, making that part of their offering and gelling the two.
And Jonathan, you touched on this earlier. The pandemic's obviously taught us a number of things, not least how to work with customers differently. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. So how are you working with customers differently, and what else do you think that you've learned from this?
So the reassuring thing is that we've learned that the technology works, that the Zoom calls like this, which no one was doing 3 months ago, have become incredibly effective means of meeting our customers and presenting to our customers. I mean, immediately after the London Book Fair, we sort of had a virtual London Book Fair with all of our customers to try to replicate the meetings that we had. And to be honest, I was a bit cynical about our ability to conduct those interviews, to conduct those meetings effectively. Most of them were incredibly productive meetings, and we were able to achieve a lot of the stuff that we wouldn't have been able to achieve face-to-face in the hall. So we've learned to improve those methods of speaking to our customers digitally. We at PAMAC have made huge efforts to try and make the website more effective and to work harder to enable our customers to access information and access assets directly from the website. So it's forced us into all sorts of new ways of working that frankly we wouldn't have contemplated before. You know, we can have a meeting with people from 2 different countries at the same time in different time zones, and we're doing that in a sort of on a regular basis, and we're all quite blasé about it now. You know, we at our office we had lovely video screens up on meeting rooms, and we weren't really using them before, and now we're using this all the time.
And Catherine, would you agree? Are you doing things differently as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what we've done at Nosy Crow from a digital presentation point of view, if we'd have put it into a strategy document, we'd have said, oh yes, well, this will take us 2 years to implement. And actually, we were there doing it within, you know, 1 or 2 weeks. I also think that the world is in a very similar boat, and that's really helped us too. There's been a worldwide decision and way of embracing this that wouldn't have been possible before. If one of us had said before, oh, can we do a Zoom presentation to you, or would you like to watch this video, it wouldn't have been the same. But we all have to do this together, and we all have to work together to achieve it. But I do think that, and Jonathan touched on this earlier on, from a customer point of view, we need our bricks and mortar bookshops to get back to normal so that they can discover our titles, Otherwise we will only be selling the classics and the top bestsellers that make it into that very competitive media space, and the rest of our wonderful titles will be lost.
And it's good to hear, David, from you that the booksellers are actually adapting as well. So it's not just the publishers that are adapting to this new way of working, but the booksellers are looking to new ways of working as well.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there have been, in the general devastation, there have been comforting signs. And one of them, as Catherine and Jonathan have indicated, is new ways of working. In fact, we used to spend a great deal of time doing what was called business continuity planning, worrying about what happened if you couldn't access your offices, for example. And actually, as it turns out, we can work from home quite successfully.
Yeah.
The issue is not so much whether we can work as a distributor, but if our customers are closed, then it's, you know, yes, we can have great Zoom meetings, but to discuss what exactly.
Yeah.
But no, there have been encouraging signs, and you know, our customers, I think, have reacted well, and yes, generally speaking, there's been communication, which has been encouraging, so that we know where customers are and how they're faring and what their plans are. So for the most part, I'd agree with Jonathan. I think we're actually in a more robust space than we might have assumed if we'd been asked what would be the impact of a pandemic of this severity on our supply chain.
And we've been joined by Neil Semple from the Department for International Trade. So welcome, Neil, and I'll bring you into the conversation very shortly. I just wanted to ask Jonathan and Catherine something that you mentioned earlier, that a lot of the titles that you had been planning to publish in the spring have been pushed forward to the later half of the year. Do you think that there's a danger that the market will be flooded with titles, and will consumers actually be open to reading all of these new titles? Will we see a surge in orders for all these titles? Or do you think that booksellers and consumers are prepared for this flood?
I think from a children's point of view, certainly the demand for children's books is going to be quite similar to, we're going into a recession across the world, I think, and children's books always remain really buoyant in that market. There is no doubt that autumn winter is going to be very, very crowded. Nosy Crow, at Nosy Crow, we didn't put all our titles that we didn't publish in the spring straight into the autumn winter. We've spread them out into next year because we anticipated that you know, we don't want a glut of them. So we remain hopeful that there are green shoots springing up all over the world, as we've talked about. And I think there will be a renewed vigour for our new titles.
Yeah, we looked at the programme very carefully, and we made a decision based on every single title and its individual circumstances. And to be honest, you know, there were a number of titles that just we knew we wouldn't be able to get the same level of sales if we published now versus later on in the year or next year. There were some that we kept in the programme, and in fact, we published Peter James. In the UK, he's published in July. We actually decided to keep it in May in Australia, and because there were so relatively few other titles out there at the same time, because a lot of other publishers moved them back, we actually achieved our biggest sale for Peter James for a Roy Grace novel, you know, that we've ever had in Australia. So it was quite interesting, but the majority, but of course he's a well-known name. He's already got an established audience. That audience wanted to read his new book. To try and make something, to try and allow something to be discovered at a time when publicity is so difficult and when displays are just impossible, would have been suicide. So whether it is going to be a too crowded environment in the second half of this year, who knows? But we'll just have to work even harder to try and, you know, make them work.
Yeah, it certainly is going to be challenging, isn't it? But I'm sure Jonathan is the same as us and all the publishers, that we just had scheduling meeting after scheduling meeting after scheduling meeting. that was the first thing that Zoom facilitated.
It was.
You know,
It was. There were a lot of those.
Thought very quick, you know, clearly and long and hard over many days about what to do.
And just thinking about pricing, David, do you think that there's an opportunity for publishers, booksellers to raise the retail pricing to make up for the loss in sales that have happened over the last 3 months?
Frankly, no. Our retailers face significant competition from the book depository and Amazon. And I doubt whether if you put up prices, they're necessarily going to adjust theirs by very much. So I would worry that what would happen is price differentials, which are already an issue, and exacerbated in Singapore by the fact that sales tax is charged on local transactions, but not on purchases from overseas, that would mean even more problems for our customers. So I would say that I wouldn't go down that route yet. It seems to me, by the way, that one of the more promising features of this general sort of delay of major titles to the second half of the year is that if we do face an issue with getting customers to come back into bookstores, that this is only going to help. And the more major titles that we have to draw people in and to restore the business to what it once was, the better. So it may be that if these titles all taken collectively may not sell as well as they might have done if they'd been delayed for a year or before the pandemic. But I think collectively they'll be very helpful, if we're lucky, in restoring a reasonable level of physical retail sales in bookstores in our part of the world. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Neil, I'd love to bring you into the discussion now, and we'll move on to what seems to be a very popular topic amongst our viewers, which is around book fairs. And at the Department for International Trade, you put a lot of effort into supporting smaller publishers with their export activities, particularly book fairs. And I just wondered at the moment, what's your view on book fairs and supporting smaller publishers? Are there other ways that you can work at the moment to support them over the next 6 months?
Yes, Emma. Okay, thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar today. I think from listening to what people said earlier, and obviously seeing what the news is today in Leicestershire, and having spoken to people in Beijing yesterday, but Beijing's closed down again, in Germany and other countries, I think we're going to face this problem really until we get a vaccine. So we could be in this world of recurrence of COVID-19 for the next 12 months. I don't want to be a person that's giving gloomy news, but I think we need to be sort of realistic. So in that sense, then we've really got to get used to the fact that we will have to use this new word in English language, a sort of blended approach between sort of digital and physical. Beijing International Book Fair is now going to be a digital-only event in August. So we've got to speak to the Publishers Association, who organised the group on behalf of the UK government, to see if we can actually provide that type of support in replace of the physical support. I know Frankfurt at the moment is going to be a sort of mixture of physical and digital. I don't know about the speakers here, but I know a number of companies may not be going to exhibit at Frankfurt. So it'll be interesting to see again if there's a resurgence of COVID-19 in Germany, whether Frankfurt will go ahead. We'll maybe try and do some of the consumer German-facing stuff, but maybe the international people, well, undoubtedly a lot of the international people will stay away, I assume. And then the other event we support is in China, Shanghai, Children's Book Fair in November. Again, we'll have to monitor closely to see what the situation is again with COVID-19. So I think what we're really talking about is looking at supporting the sector virtually over the next 12 months. But in addition to book fairs, we can also do that through curated webinars. We've been doing a lot of those in other sectors, music, video games, children's content. And we do really get very impressive numbers of people wanting to take part in these webinars. And if the content is right, if it's about a specific opportunity in a market, whether it's China, whether it's the US, whether it's Latin America, I'm sure we can actually get an audience for those activities.
And I guess it might be helpful to hear from smaller publishers about what support they think that you might be able to provide. So getting smaller publishers to suggest support that they might be able to provide for you. So where can you help them? So I think I'd encourage any small publishers that are on the webinar to either put it in the chat or message MLO or myself afterwards, and we can communicate that to Neil. Some creative ideas on how DIT can support you through this. Can I ask Jonathan and Catherine what your thoughts are on book fairs?
Well, as Neil said, they are a real moving feast at the moment. I think we're remaining open to the idea of going to Frankfurt at the moment. I know a lot of the other publishers, the bigger publishers, have said that they won't be going from the UK, but we still are thinking about going, but the feedback from a lot of our customers is that they won't be attending. So that's going to, we're just going to play it by ear and make a decision as late as we can, because we want to go, we really want to support everybody, but with all the regional lockdowns and things taking place, it's very difficult to know. I think that Beijing's offering of a digital fair, if that's going to go ahead, is an excellent one, and I think, like Neil said, it's going to be more and more likely that that's going to be the way forward. I know that Beijing are also offering a representative, a Mandarin speaker who would stand on your stand, and that I think will be really useful for us, along with the iPad communication and the rolling video screens. But again, it goes back to this willingness that we all have all across the world to make this work. But certainly at Nosy Crow, we're quite open to staying up all night and seeing who wants to talk to us. But going forward to Shanghai as well, and obviously Shanghai for us is absolutely crucial. But again, I have a feeling that we will be relying very much on those digital ways forward.
Jonathan?
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, we at Macmillan have already decided we're not going to be attending Frankfurt. And as much as anything, that's just to give ourselves the certainty of knowing that, we have to plan for something else. And I hope we can conduct, really effective meetings that we would have had there. What you can't replicate, of course, are those chance encounters, those people you meet in the aisles, those people, dare I say it, you meet in the bar late at night that you wouldn't have otherwise had a chance to speak to, and it's very frustrating that we won't be able to do that. On the other hand, Frankfurt is an expensive fair to attend, so we naturally have to limit the number of people who go. We don't expect to see every single one of our customers, and I guess if you're having a virtual fair, then there's no limit to how many people you can actually involve in the conversation and meet up with as well. I personally wasn't planning to go to Beijing this year. Other people in the team were. I now have the chance to join those meetings, so that's a positive.
There's benefits.
Yeah, and I guess we will learn how to try and replicate some of the things that the book fair does. It's not all about, as I say, the half an hour crammed meeting that you normally have on the stand. You've got to think about other ways that you're promoting your books and try and do that digitally and in an effective way.
And so in your view, with like the ability to travel much less, do you feel confident that you'll be able to secure the same amount of face-to-face time, albeit digitally, with customers, or do you think that other pressures might take over?
I think we're great chameleons. Oh, sorry, Jonathan.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think we're great chameleons, and in this time we have adapted so well. I think there was one thing that Jonathan touched on, and that's there is nothing that will replicate quite a customer coming onto the stand, particularly again for children's books that have so many wonderful novelties and touch and feels in them, and actually picking up a book and saying, wow, I had no idea that this was one of yours, or that this could be done. And that sense of excitement is hard to replicate, even, you know, with our video technology. But again, there are benefits. Like Jonathan says, we've got time limits. You know, that awful half-an-hour slot at book fairs can now be replaced by longer meetings where we need them. But it's those water cooler moments in Shanghai that you do miss, where you suddenly have a brainwave about something that you can do together, or a project that you can do together. But I think, like Jonathan, I'd like to remain optimistic that yes, we've lost a few ways of working and opportunities, but we've gained a whole load of expertise as well.
I think, Emma, it's incredibly important in markets like China. People have been going to China for many years, as I have, is that the key cultural thing there is trust and relationships. And so it's very important that we continue to engage with the Chinese, although there's always, you know, some sort of political issue going on between us and China. But in terms of the commercial side, they're incredibly committed to working with the UK. So if we have like virtual activity in Beijing and Shanghai, it's important that we can continue to do that. I was really struck when I went to see the smaller companies in the last two Frankfurt Book Fairs I've been to. Virtually everyone said they were doing business with China, or wanted to do business with China. So I think we've really got to keep that relationship going, because if you're seen to withdraw from the market, it's very hard to re-establish yourself, because that's the culture in China.
Yeah, and one thing I was really worried about from a growing publisher point of view was that we would not be able to grow our new customer base. And actually, that hasn't been the case. You could say about China and Taiwan and Korea, Neil. We've benefited in the last few months with a whole raft of new customers coming on board, which I've been really, really pleased about, because that was my worry, that by not seeing them face to face and not being at the bookseller and fairs, then we were going to lose that, and that hasn't happened.
Can I ask Jonathan and Catherine, some of the questions in the chat that I've been reading are asking about the long-term impact of this. So presumably, let's say there's a vaccine and commercial air travel goes back to normal. Do you think there'll be any impact on the book fairs in the longer term? Because you've just been saying, both of you, that actually we can sort of do electronic substitutes for much of what we would got. Perhaps not quite as good, but pretty good. And then when you weigh that against the high cost to publishers of actually attending these fairs, some of the questions are, what's the longer term impact?
Jonathan, I think I mentioned already about cost, and I think that that's something that has, you know, very much at the forefront of our minds. I think we might look at more local representation, but that would take time, and also, yeah, a new combination, a more exciting, vibrant, innovative combination. I don't think there will ever be a time when we decide that no face-to-face contact is the way we want to go. But I do think it's given us a great opportunity.
That's right. I mean, I can't see, we need book fairs. There's no question we need book fairs. We need book fairs to build the relationships in the first place, to meet new customers. I think what will happen after Frankfurt is that publishers and booksellers will realize that they've saved a bit of money by not attending, and they'll think in future that they'll have to make decisions, maybe more brutal decisions about who actually attends and how it's organized in the future. But there's no question we need book fairs, and we need the excitement, the sort of drama of a book fair to actually launch books. You know, when we have a big book to launch into the market, we think very carefully about a sequence of book fairs that will do that job, and how we can make the most impression from the stand, and all the material that goes with it is a key part of our promotion. So we're probably going to be a bit more selective about who attends, maybe, but we'll definitely be back as soon as we possibly can.
And Emma, of course, we've also got London Book Fair next March. And London this year was cancelled very late. And I know there were some issues, so I need to be very diplomatic. I imagine Reid might be on the call. But again, March is not very far away. And, you know, are people starting to book space for London, or are they seeing what happened last year? So it'll be interesting to see what people's views are about London Book Fair next year as well. Does that have a long-term future, given what the speeches have just spoken about in terms of people can save money by not doing the book fairs necessarily?
We'll definitely want to be there. We'll definitely want to be there, and we'll, you know, I'm thinking that March next year might be the time when we all need to regroup and you know, make some big gestures about the rest of next year. I'm hopeful that will happen, and we'll definitely be there.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said before, we're remaining really optimistic about all the book fairs, even those that are nearer in the future, and London for us is absolutely key. Yeah, we'll be there if we possibly can.
As a trade visitor, as opposed to an exhibitor at these fairs, Pansing generally has 4 to 5 people visiting London and Frankfurt. And if the publishers are there, we'll be there too. Partly, I mean, one reason for that, by the way, is the suspicion that if we weren't there, our competitors were, that it might be bruited about that we were actually in some form of crisis. But apart from that, no, it's as Jonathan, I think, said, and Catherine too, there's something that you cannot replicate through other means about a book fair where there's face-to-face contact, and the relationships between us as a distributor and our publishers are absolutely critical to us. And so that face-to-face contact, there is no substitute for it. The only thing I would say is that during the period when the London Book Fair gradually sort of, how can I put it, disintegrated before it was finally cancelled, in other words, everybody pulled out, one issue was that my colleagues, the 4 people who were due to come with me, they also pulled out, even before some of the publishers. In other words, they basically said, we do not want to go. And as an employer, our view was, we are certainly not going to force our staff to do something that they think might sort of endanger their health. So if everything is cleared up by March, for example, when we have the London Book Fair, then I don't imagine that there'll be a problem. But if it isn't, if we're still without a vaccine, if there's still a significant number of infections, merely traveling to the fair is a potentially dangerous thing to do. And although I might be willing to come to the UK for obvious reasons, because I've got other things to do besides see publishers, potentially, my colleagues, based on experience, may not. So that's just a small point to mention.
I think that's a really important point, and one that, you know, we had a duty of care to our employees to not attend the London Book Fair. We were very nervous about attending the book fair, and we feel the same about. I feel the same about asking my team to go on any trip at the moment. You know, I can't imagine asking anyone in my team to get on a plane at the moment and go to another country. I can imagine that a lot of our customers would be uncomfortable about us visiting for exactly the same reasons. So we have to think first about our team and about our customers, and then work around that.
I completely agree. That's exactly the same for us. That's why it's such a fluid situation, isn't it? We just have to take every week as it comes. But certainly, like you, Jonathan, we respect all our colleagues and the way that they feel at this time, and everybody has different personal circumstances, and there are all the different quarantine rules that keep being imposed and taken away, and yeah, it's a real day-to-day situation. Honestly, I just think that for Nosy Crow, we're a much smaller team, so we might be able to, you know, decide, Kate or I, to suddenly get on a plane with 24 hours notice, but we would never expect anyone else to do that if they felt concerned in any way.
Yeah, and questions come in for you, Catherine, about whether it's worth just visiting and not having a stand.
That's an interesting question. Possibly. I always feel that there's an opportunity, and it's tempting to go somewhere where you think there won't be so many people attending because you get a little bit more airspace. But without a stand, it's much more difficult to bump into the right people. So that's a bit more of a tricky dilemma.
Yeah, yeah. Neil, very quickly, one of the benefits of your job is that you work across a number of different creative industries, not just publishing. I mean, are you seeing any reactions from, say, the film, TV, music world about how they're dealing with their export strategies? Are we missing a trick, for example, or is there anything we can learn from what other industries are doing to build up their export at the moment?
Well, it's a really mixed picture. I mean, if you're in the digital space, and people were talking earlier about digital, and of course in the UK we've got a great explosion of audio and podcasts as well. It's a real revolution. You know, people like the Times and have got their own radio station, for example. But on anything that's live, you know, like live music and experience economy, museums, theatres are really suffering or on the ground. I mean, things like, you know, music streaming and music publishing is still doing okay, but the live sector is completely halted. If you're in that digital space, video games, animation, obviously now more than half of publishing, I think people have been able to show more resilience, be able to work from home largely and retain productivity. And I think in the long term, I don't like the word levelling up, but I mean, people understand what the levelling up agenda is. I mean, if people, particularly the small publishers who are based up in the regions, maybe it's shown to them, well, we don't necessarily have to have people in London. Do young people have to, like, you know, go down to London to work and have to pay lots of rent and make their way up in the publishing ladder? Obviously, a lot of the companies are going to be there and will continue to be there, but maybe on the social geography of the UK, it'll start to help reshape things to some extent. I think film and TV have done a fantastic job working with DCMS and the government to get safe film production resuming. I think their big challenge is going to get insurance for the talent. So if you know, if you've got Tom Cruise shooting in Pinewood and he falls ill, you know, who's actually going to provide insurance? So they're talking to the Treasury about that. So I think really a lot of it's around the resilience. I think digital content really is going to accelerate even further. But looking at the bookshops having opened again, I think that's good news for the smaller publishers, that people can start to look at titles maybe differently than they would do, you know, online. And of course, looking at the cross-specialisation of creative, you look at the success of Normal People and BBC Three and Hulu in the States. I think it is great that the seeds of creativity are coming from publishing, then going into other media art forms, and I think that's a very positive thing as well.
Of course, something we've noticed is that authors have got a lot more time on their hands, and their writing schedules have accelerated incredibly. So there's the production requirements of producing a book are not as huge as those for making a TV show or a film. And so, you know, we're in the position where we've actually been able to schedule some things for next year that we weren't expecting to be able to publish.
And there's a couple of questions that have come in on the chat that I'd like to just try and fit in before we finish. And one is very specific, which is about Canada as a market. And have you seen much impact on Canada as a market? So
Canada is one of those markets that hasn't been as badly affected as others. Obviously, there was a bookstore shut down, but I think most of the Indigo bookstores are now back open again. I think they've handled the situation incredibly well, but like everyone, you know, we don't know how it's gonna play out in the end.
Anything to add to that, Catherine?
No, not really. It's one of those markets where you just keep your fingers crossed that everything is going to stay good and well for them.
Yeah. And then one specifically has come in for you, David, about air freight costs, and note that it's always high for importing books from the UK and the US, especially during this post-pandemic time. And the question is, Pansing, as the leading distributor in the region, is there a possibility that it could become a logistic hub in Singapore where we can combine orders and books by air freight to distribute to other retail booksellers?
Okay, well, firstly, it's worth saying something that I didn't actually sort of mention earlier, which is that after shooting upwards, air freight rates have been coming back down.
Okay.
So, and in fact, for us, the two biggest supply sources are the US and the UK, and our ex-US air freight rates, for a variety of reasons, are now pretty much down to where they were before. And ex-UK, when it first shot up, we stopped air freighting entirely and switched to sea freight. But now we're actually able to resume at least some air freight, less frequently and less in amount, but still it's about, I think, 50% higher now, as opposed to 7 times higher at its peak. The things have improved. I'm assuming that the questioner, I don't know, I mean, the gentleman's name is Vietnamese, I think. And if I got that wrong, I do apologize to him or indeed her. But I get the impression he's probably not in Singapore. And Singapore is indeed a hub for the region. But it wouldn't do you very much good to air freight books into Singapore if you're then going to have to pay a fortune to air freight them out to Cambodia or Vietnam or Thailand. So I'm not clear that this would really work or be advantageous to customers in those other territories. That said, you know, I mean, any commercial opportunity we should be seizing, yes, in current times. But I'm slightly sceptical that becoming a hub in Singapore would work. And in fact, our experience of the region pre-COVID is that the supply chains are mostly set up, or were set up, to supply into markets like Thailand and, for example, direct from the US and the UK. And when freight costs are largely a function of how much you're freighting rather than the distance that the goods are traveling. So if you're set up to air freight things from the US and the UK, and you've never really done anything importing from Singapore, if you're a Thai customer, then it might actually save you nothing to be getting stuff from Singapore, because you know, the route is new and the potential carriers have no particular reason to offer you a very great rate. Whereas the traditional routes that you've been using, probably you'd be able to get a better rate, even though the distance is hugely further. So I think it's probably not quite the obvious solution that the questioner might think.
Right. That's great to explore. One final question that we haven't covered in the chat goes slightly back to where we were discussing about dealing with customers in a digital and virtual environment. And the question that's come in is, how do you actually build trust in that virtual environment, especially if it's a new customer? Any top tips?
I think it's all the really obvious stuff. Sorry, I'm not sure I've got a crystal ball, but I think it's just making sure that you respond really quickly, that you're very receptive to their needs, that you try and find out exactly what's going on in their market and what they need from you, and just going that extra mile, sending them digital assets that they haven't asked for, that might be useful to them, just showing that you're really thoughtful and responsive to their needs. As I said earlier, the new customer relationships are the ones that worry me the most, and the ones that, as a result of that, we're working as hard as we can to think about every single thing that we can do for them. But you know, it's Jonathan will be doing exactly the same with his team. It is obvious stuff. It's just spending the time, allocating the time to get to know them. Yeah. The language barrier is always a problem with Zoom calls, but you know, at least you've got that video link, and you've got those facial expressions, and just showing that you're sympathetic to their needs.
Yeah, I think clearly every retailer needs to be thinking about having an online offering, whether that's a digital online offering or an audio online offering, or just a online fulfillment offering. And it's very difficult for smaller customers to get started on that. You know, it feels like the infrastructure is very expensive. All I'd say is there are people that they can partner with to get to that situation. And but the important thing is to take advantage of their place in the community, their local experience, and their local audience is what will distinguish them from the sort of global giants. And so all of that is linked to the trust element that you were talking about earlier on. I think it's really important. One positive thing that's come out of these last 3 weeks is basically the resilience of the book and the appeal of a book as a form of entertainment. I've read many more books in the last 3 months than I did the previous year, and I think people have worldwide.
And so I'm going to ask you as the final question to look into your crystal ball once more and see if you can answer. I mean, exports account for about 50% of UK publishing revenues. Do you think we'll see a dip in the sales figures for next year? And will the face of UK publishing exports be altered forever? Or do you think there might be a slight dip this year and then we'll bounce back and continue shipping books around the world?
Is that to us, Emma? Sorry, I lost my
Yeah, sorry, you go, Catherine.
A couple of minutes. Well, I'm the eternal optimist, and you know, we export is a relatively new channel for us, and so I would hope that that we would still be forging ahead. You know, I particularly believe that there are still great wins for us as Nosy Crow in Asia this year, but I don't know whether I should mention the B word at the end of this, but you know, we are going to have a transition to Brexit and to navigate into, and disruption to trading routes in certainly Europe are going to be something that we have to deal with too. So you know, we've got another juggernaut coming our way, but I think this pandemic has shown us that we can deal really effectively with anything that's thrown at us. And I think the pandemic will become a lot more, dare I say, manageable in terms of regional needs at any one time and country needs at any one time. So I remain really optimistic. And I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your whole question, because I did lose you.
I think it does. I think it does. What does your crystal ball tell us, Jonathan?
Me too. I'm optimistic. I mean, a lot of the problems we've been talking about today have been short-term logistical problems. You know, air freight costs increasing, all of that sort of stuff. But as I said, the fundamentals of the appeal of the book remain, and the fundamentals of the potential growth in international markets still remain. You know, the UK is still is a relatively mature market. We are dealing with all sorts of markets around the world where the quality of English is improving, where people are looking for English content, and that's not going to change. We've just got to find better ways of reaching those consumers, those readers who are increasing in number all the time.
And I think, as you say, Jonathan, there may be a shift in the way we get books to those markets through local printing or print on demand. But fingers crossed, people still keep reading our books, and exports in the obvious sense of the word continues. Well, I'd like to thank all of our viewers today for tuning in and listening to the conversation and contributing with your questions. They've really helped stimulate the conversation today. But I'd really like to thank you for, as panelists, for taking time out to have this conversation. Congratulations again to Jonathan and Catherine on winning the award. And thank you again to David for sponsoring it.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you, Emma.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
Bye.